Hi everyone. I'm Matthew Trahan. I'm the Pro Dean for Research and Innovation in the Faculty of Arts, Humanities and Cultures. And I was really thrilled when I was invited to say a couple of words at the opening of Leila's Inaugural. And I was so thrilled because I absolutely love working with Leila. We work together on a committee and in all sorts of ways, and I thought it's going to be really easy because I've got so many things that I like about Leila. And then I realized that to try and figure out how to kind of condense that into a couple of minutes was really, really hard. So I've thought quite a lot about what to say now, and I'm still not sure I'm going to get it right. But given that we've got the theme of failure for this evening, I figure I'm going to be okay. So I've tried to write down some thoughts. So the first thing that I appreciated from pretty much the first conversation I had with Leila was her intellectual power. Now, that sounds like the wrong phrase for Leila. It sounds kind of pretentious, right? And Leila's anything but pretentious. But there's something about the way she thinks, the way she combines her experience and knowledge of arts management, the way she combines that with policy, with understanding of policy, with an understanding of social and political theory, that just is really compelling. And every time I talk to Leila, I think, this is just a really interesting person, and I'd like to hear more from her. So I think that intellectual power is something that probably everyone who works with Leila has a strong sense of, but it struck me from the first instant, and I haven't stopped valuing that. I also think that her belief in the power of failure is really infectious, and it's not just a kind of academic project or an academic idea, but it's something that seems to carry through in all sorts of ways in how she works. And what it means is not just that she's got incredible ideas, she's got such a kind of powerful, kind of countercultural approach to things that always takes you a bit by surprise, but it also means that she's an absolutely brilliant person to work with. And we often talk in the workplace about the power of disagreement, the need for us to disagree effectively. And when I thought about the conversations I've had with Leila over the last couple of years, actually there have been quite a lot of disagreements, I suspect. Usually Leila was right and I was wrong, but you don't always feel that you're having a disagreement with Leila. In fact, you rarely do. She finds ways to ask questions or to just make statements which kind of point you towards a better truth. And I think part of that is that she's all about looking through obvious statements to see the reality beyond. That's what her work does, but that's how she is, that's how she operates. So with the kind of work that we do together, that's incredibly powerful and helpful, right? If you say something that's a bit glib or a bit kind of neat sounding, she'll always take you past that. But she'll do it in a way that doesn't make you feel like you've been kind of schooled. She'll make you feel like you've kind of found that way yourself. And I think that it's this belief in the really strong power of failure that actually helps with all of that, an enormous amount, right? She's passionate about this idea, whilst recognizing that everything that any of us say could be wrong at any moment. And that's kind of almost the ideal of academic life for me. And it's so rare that actually you come across it in such a complete way as you do with Leila. So all of those things just mean that I find her a magnificent colleague. She's incredibly important to the arts and humanities at Leeds because of her ideas, but also because of the way she is and the way that she works. So Leila, I'm so pleased to be here celebrating your inaugural lecture with you, and I can't wait to hear the lecture, and just delighted to be here. So thanks so much for everything. And I will now hand over to Ben.
Thanks, Matthew, and welcome everyone. On behalf of the School of Performance and Cultural Industries, we're really excited to celebrate Leila's inaugural. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Ben Walmsley. I'm a Professor of Cultural Engagement here in the school and Director of the Centre for Cultural Value, where I work very closely with Leila. And I'm not going to be half as eloquent as Matthew, but I have known Leila and worked with Leila for a very long time, so I can dish the dirt on Leila, which is a lot more exciting. But in all seriousness, it's a great honour and privilege to be able to introduce Leila this evening. I think we've worked together since 2008, back at Leeds Met, which shows already how old we are. And it's really lovely to see colleagues here from Leeds Beckett to support Leila and hear more about Leila's journey and her thoughts around failure and its importance in the cultural industries in particular. So we've worked together on lots of various projects over that time. I think one of the early ones was evaluating Leeds Light Night, which got us into some sticky waters, looking at constructive failure and things that can go wrong with those global mega events, and we're still thinking and talking very much about that as we research Leeds 2023. But I think when I was looking at the title of this lecture, I was thinking how ironic it is really that we're here thinking about failure in the context of Leila's inaugural, because failure is the last word that would come to mind when you think about Leila's huge contribution to the school, to thinking around cultural policy, the really, really positive impact that you've had, Leila, on, I want to say generations of students, but that makes you sound ancient. Lots of students, lots of different cohorts of students over the years in 2 different universities. And increasingly through the really recognition that AHRC have given to Leila's work on failure, to a really significant project looking at why cultural policy doesn't always succeed and doesn't make systemic change. So your work has been hugely valuable and the antithesis of failure. And I know that everyone in the room has probably worked with you, worked alongside you, been a beneficiary of your intellectual strength that Matthew was talking about. So a huge thank you for not being a failure in terms of your own career, but a huge thank you as a colleague and a peer, I suppose, from cultural policy, of really raising these questions that are difficult and knotty, aren't they? About failure, how the sector that's often so defensive about its right to exist and be properly funded can actually move beyond advocacy and think about failure in a much more honest and open and constructive and productive way. So like Matthew, I'm really looking forward to hearing Leila talk about the role that failure has played in your career and how it's influenced your thinking and theorisation as well as your engagement with the sector. So it's probably enough from me. I'd just like to invite you all to obviously stay behind at the end and have a glass of wine with us. The main reason that we're here is to celebrate Leila's career and Leila's contribution to practice, to policy, to academia. So a huge warm welcome from us. Please do enjoy the lecture, stay behind for a chat afterwards and ask any questions. And without further ado, I'd love to hand over to Professor Leila Jancovich.
Thank you, Matthew, and thank you, Ben, for those introductions. The good thing about, as John Ward said to me when I first got the funding to do the research on failure, the good thing about researching something like failure is if everything goes wrong tonight, I can still say that's part of the research. So I don't live up to their introductions, that's okay with me. Thank you all for coming. It's kind of an odd experience to be talking to such a mixed group. I've got friends and family in, I've got old colleagues, new colleagues, people from the sector, people from academia, and hopefully some students who said they were coming, but you know what students are like. Don't know if they've actually turned up. Oh, I've got somebody waving, so there are definitely some students in tonight. So yeah, thank you very much for coming. I am, as Ben said, going to talk about failure throughout my career as a kind of demonstration on what Matthew was talking about why I think it's so important and valuable to do so. So kind of thinking about where it all started, having studied theatre studies as my first degree, it seemed right that I should start with a quote from theatre, from a playwright. Although I'm not entirely convinced with Samuel Beckett's quote, particularly the bit about no matter. I think it does matter if we fail, but it matters what we do with that failure. It's also, I put this quote in because in the recent research I've been doing, the number of people who referred to that quote said they had it pinned up on their notice boards in the office or wore it as a badge. But when I kind of asked them to talk further, it was very clear it was an aspiration, not something they necessarily actually lived by. That the very people who said they had it pinned on their wall then acknowledged they found it very difficult to talk about failure in practice. Excuse me. But so as I say, talking about the role failure has played first in my life, I started actually not really with a particular interest in theatre. My first interest was in politics. As a child, we were more likely to be taken to see Karl Marx's grave or on a demonstration at weekends than we were to the theatre or certainly not to the church. Although actually at my mother's funeral last year, my brothers did remind me that under the age of 10 we were taken to see 6-hour versions of War and Peace, the Russian version. So there was that engagement with the arts and culture from an early age, but only some rock stuff. You can gather the politics of my parents. So from that kind of background, I very much fell into theatre by accident. Very international parents, but I failed my language O-level, and that already limited the choices of courses I could apply to. I then didn't get the grades I was expected to do for history, so I couldn't go to my first choice university. So I actually ended up studying English and Theatre Studies at Warwick University, not by choice, but because they were the only ones that would actually take me. And a little bit of me thinking theatre studies must be easy because plays are shorter than novels. So that was kind of my introduction to theatre, really. But when I was there, I studied under two people who need to get a mention for me, Clive Barker and Tony Howard. Tony Howard, who I did invite tonight but was unable to travel, and Clive Barker, who's no longer with us, who really kind of inspired and influenced me. And specifically, I studied political theatre under them, and became really interested in how we could marry the politics and the theatre together. But I also, over the 3 years, became increasingly conscious that these political theatre people weren't actually changing the world in the way that they maybe hoped to. And so my dissertation was partly just for the joy of going to do it, was going around interviewing some of the great political theatre writers of the day and talking to them. And I guess looking back at it, talking to them about failure, although clearly I wasn't thinking of it in those terms at that time. So that's people like, from a theatre background, Trevor Griffiths, Ken Lynch, who people will know. I interviewed all of them to talk about why they weren't changing the world. And in the naivety of youth, I left university thinking I was going to do it better, and I was going to change the world even if they hadn't. So, my early working life then was as a theatre producer, and I then went on very much to be an arts consultant. Within that time, I spent 8 years working with, who's now my best friend, Shanine Buffina, who's recently been running Coventry City of Culture. And we were very much working with kind of new independent theatre scene, developing kind of the careers of young experimental artists. And during that time, I kind of really lived through the experience of Thatcher's economisation of culture and the way that more and more theatre companies were expected to think about making money rather than changing the world, and look to sponsorship rather than subsidy. I'm really conscious of what that did to both to the work of practitioners, but also to the type of practitioners that got to make work. I then equally lived through the Blair years and the so-called golden years for the arts, when there was a massive increase in funding, but it still went to the same people. At the end of 13 years of the Blair government, there might have been a lot more money around, but 85% of the funding went to the same organisations that had got it at the beginning of the period. So, I also was quite sceptical of that approach as well. And so I became increasingly interested not in how the arts could change the political landscape, but in understanding the politics of the arts landscape. And that's really what drove me into an interest in examining cultural policy and examining the failures of cultural policy. So whilst I was still working as a producer and consultant, I did my early bits of research, and they were very much commissioned research by the sector, for the sector, about the sector, very much about making recommendations for what the sector should be doing. I put some examples there. Piece of research I did for the Edinburgh Fringe about the independent theatre sector, which was the precursor to the British Council Showcase that now exists, to try and raise the profile of independent artists. A rather bizarre piece of research I was commissioned to do, looking at cafes in arts venues as an income generating source. Not an obvious choice for me to do the research on, but I do like food, I suppose. And the interesting thing there was actually, what really surprised me was how many venues, and I won't name them for obvious reasons, how many venues were using Arts Council to subsidise their cafes rather than cafes generating money to subsidise the arts. That was quite an eye-opener. Some pretty big established venues, which, if you give me a drink, I'll tell you who they are. And then I often thank the Arts Council for pushing me into academia for the piece of research on the right airborne, which was commissioned specifically by the Arts Council to make recommendations for the development of the youth circus sector. And I spent more time arguing with the person who commissioned me from the Arts Council, it's the whole of the Arts Council, over where I was allowed to use the word recommendation than I did doing the whole of the research. Because a recommendation is something they should act on. If I could just change the word to aspiration, they could put it on a shelf and not do anything with it. And it was that, really, that partly influenced my decision. I wanted to do research that wasn't constricted by that, and wasn't facing those challenges I've talked about how you keep your critical distance when you're doing research, how you deal with bringing about change in a sector that doesn't want to change. So I moved into academia, naively in the belief that I would have complete independence, be able to do research without having to be making the case, without having to justify anything. Draw from an interdisciplinary field of researchers across the whole landscape, not just within the arts, but further afield. But very well aware that the tension there between, that would give me more distance, but it also that distance could make it harder to actually have impact. And so I've always had an interest in how we make sure in academia that we still are having impact. And I guess the other bit of naivety, not realising that, of course, the same economisation of higher education had taken place as in the arts, and so many of the same pressures to bring in money, to do the right kind of research that would have impact. The easiest way to have impact is do things that people don't disagree with, rather than things that really challenge people. So that's kind of always been an issue for me since I've come into academia. So my early academic research, and I'm very happy to have my PhD supervisor in the audience, Jonathan Long, so thanks for coming, Jonathan. And Franco Bianchini, who's not here, he's in Italy, so I'll let him off. But my early research was looking at participation in the cultural sector and the politics around it and the role of participatory decision making. And I kind of had a number of research questions which I put around what we mean by participation in the first place, the different definitions that people use, and the different purposes to what they're trying to achieve through participation. Questions about who participates, who gets to have a say, and how that influences the outcomes of whatever's happening, about the processes, practice, and the profile of the work. And I've highlighted all those words. They weren't actually necessarily the words I was using in the PhD at the time in the early research, but because they're words that when I look back on my research, I realise those are words that have recurred in my research of failure more recently, but really were there from the beginning of my research journey. So the approach I took, both in that PhD and in my subsequent early journal articles, was very much taking that interdisciplinary approach I talked about. The work I look at very much draws from political science, from sociology, development studies, public policy, cultural studies, quite a wide range, But I tried to summarise when I was doing this and what the main recurring themes in my research are. And I guess the two main theories I look at and throughout my research I've put there are capital and agency. And the students here will be sick of hearing me talk about capital and agency probably. But I particularly am interested in the tension in theories there. So if we think about the idea of cultural capital, you have the approach from Robert Putnam, which is the approach that the cultural sector tends to take, which is the idea that we need to build people's cultural capabilities, their cultural capital, so that they can feel more full and citizens. And through doing that, we will reduce inequality. We will make everyone feel included. So it's the whole social inclusion agenda. But that's very different to what Pierre Bourdieu talks about when he's talking about capital as something that's finite, that just like money, there's only so much of it to go around. I mean, obviously you can print more money, but ignore that bit. But he argues that far from giving people cultural capital, reducing inequality, it merely seeks to perpetuate inequality, that you take individuals out of the situation, but you leave the situation unchanged. And so I'm kind of, I've taken a very critical approach to the cultural sector's focus on the Putnam approach to cultural capital. Similarly, with the theory of agency, the idea that if people have power and self-determination in their lives, not only do their lives change, but as Beverly Rhodes would say, the decisions that are made about the world change, the world itself changes, versus Stephen Luke's, who says, no it doesn't. Those voices just get subsumed by the mainstream. They just, we allow those things to happen so that we can reappropriate them to maintain the status quo. So again, kind of very interested in the challenge in my own research on participation about does participation bring about change or not. So those are kind of the underpinning theories, and then I've kind of drawn on models from public policy that look at ways of increasing participation and agency and cultural through models of deliberative democracy and participatory governance, which really were about seeing the shift from just getting people to take part in activities to take part in the decisions about their lives, or indeed about what activities they might be invited to take part in. And I've tried to apply all of that to case studies within the cultural sector. And those are a range of the case studies that I've looked at. Again, I could talk about any of them in the bar. You can read articles about them. I'm not going to go through all of them because we'd be here all night and there's drink to be drunk. But just kind of in brief summary of what they show, what was very apparent from the research I did was that there was a real shift in language and practice from just talking about participation in cultural activity to talking about participation in decision making, talking about co-production, talking about ownership, rather than just about taking part in something that somebody has organised for you. And there were examples in those case studies that have had a transformational effect. If you take the example of Contact Theatre in Manchester, that literally completely changed both the programme on stage and the demographic of the audience as a result of their kind of more participatory approach. So there's fantastic examples of how such approaches can bring about real, meaningful, powerful change. But what was also very apparent from my research was there was quite a lot of resistance to this shift from the cultural sector. So whilst there might be more talk about participatory decision making, there are just as many people who didn't want to see it happen, or who were doing exactly what Stephen Luke talks about, appropriating the language to make it less transformational. And so as a result of that, the word participation, I argue, has become quite performative in itself, that it just becomes a word that can mean anything to anyone and therefore loses its power transformation. And we can see that in the evidence that actually those same questions about who participates and the power they have that were there when I started doing my PhD are still there how many years later, and Jonathan might remember when I started, I certainly don't. And yeah, and as the quote there says from the Arts Council, this pie chart is to demonstrate. I did an analysis of Arts Council application forms, and these were under the criteria. What are you doing to increase participation? And that's a range of different things they define participation by. And if you can read from that distance, they range from things as basic as having a website and doing some marketing, through to the kind of more transformational ones. So there wasn't the same evidence there of that transformational shift that was there in the documents. And probably most significantly, there wasn't evidence that the Arts Council assessments of those applications prioritised one version over the other. They just said, yeah, they ticked the box on participation, rather than a sort of more detailed analysis of how they were defining it. So my conclusions from all of that, which was the original title of my new research project, is that there are a very large number of participatory projects, initiatives, policies that are going out there. And there are really committed efforts from practitioners to really make a difference. And if you believe the evaluations and reports that are written about them, every one of them is a fantastic success. You'll never read an evaluation that says that it wasn't successful. But despite that, there is no actual evidence in the very data. So if you take something like the Creative People and Places initiative, which gets a lot of attention in the media, that was set up on the basis of the criteria for getting funding for Creative People and Places is that you're in an area, a location deemed to be low in rates of participation, so you get funding to increase participation. So there is a logic, if that is your aim, that you would then measure whether they increase participation. That would be a measure of success. Not at all saying it's the only measure of success, but it would certainly be a measure of success. And actually what the Arts Council did was cut the funding to this very survey that they used to create the data, because, and I quote, because that would be setting the projects up to fail. And so, there is a kind of, that, for me, was a real kind of wake up, there really is no space to talk about failure, and therefore no space to learn from it. So, as a result of that, despite the massive industry around cultural participation, I've argued that there's a failure to measure the right, and others have argued there's a failure to measure the right things, to measure what we're talking about participation. Everyone participates in their culture. They just might not participate in the things that DCMS has deemed as a value for them to participate in. There's a failure to invest in the breadth of things that people are already participated in and make sure we're resourcing adequately, equitably, and fairly. And for me, not most important, but most relevant to the work I'm trying to do at the moment is that there's a failure to learn and which leads to the failure to change. If you don't talk about failure, the temptation is you just go on doing the same. If you read an evaluation that says doing something was a fantastic success, why would you do anything other than just repeat that again? Whereas if you write an evaluation that is about failure, the onus is on you to say, and what would you do differently next time? And that encourages change. So my current research, which is what Matthew was referring to at the beginning, and Ben referred to, that AHRC have very generously funded for the last 4 years now. There's a thing called COVID in the middle, so I'm not quite sure how long anything is anymore. And that was research specifically to look at what the benefits might be of a focus on failure and how we might do it. Before my voice fails. So this research is very much informed by research from policy studies, critical policy studies, a range of literature that challenges the focus on evidence-based policy. And that's the idea that policymakers make decisions based on hard, robust evidence. And the literature criticises that on two counts. One, that isn't how people make decisions. They make decisions based on pressure groups, based on personal taste, based on their networks, and that the evidence plays a very, very small part in decision making. And then the second thing is that evidence-based policy assumes that evidence is neutral rather than created by somebody who will bias it to suit their ends anyway. So the literature says actually that our focus on evidence, accountability, evaluations is wrong in the first place. It doesn't contribute anything to the discourse, and it doesn't inform decision making. Oh, and we also looked a lot at research, a growing body of research that's coming out of policy studies that also is talking about the value of talking about failure, or more generally, talking about the lack of talking about failure. But this literature, we realised, just wasn't being talked about within the cultural sector, and so we've drawn a lot of that into the models that we've then developed. And what we did, and I've moved into talking about we, because I should credit my co-researcher David Stevenson from Queen Margaret University in Edinburgh, who's lived through this journey with me for the last 3 or 4 years doing research together. What we did was we started by doing a load of workshops in the sector because we were very conscious that we didn't want the definitions of success and failure to come from us. We wanted them to come from the sector. So we co-produced what success and failure meant with them. We then talked to people about their attitudes to failure, and what was very clear from that was an awful lot of people didn't even think we should be doing the research. We had people tell us it was dangerous to do the research. They didn't know why HRC had given us the funding. We'd end up being the death of the cultural sector if we continued. Real antagonism to it from some parts to begin with. So it probably didn't take that, but that reinforced the idea that we also wanted to do some case studies, and it kind of was pretty obvious that going to somebody and saying, I'd like to interview you about your failures wouldn't go down too well. So what we did instead was we asked people to say what the most successful examples of cultural participation they could think of were, and then went to them and said, everyone said you were a success, how would you feel about talking about some of your failures along the way? And I won't name who they are, but there you can see them in the book. But I really thank them. Those who are in the book are the ones who said yes. There were many more who didn't say yes to going on that journey with us. And so we looked at, well, I guess I can say the ones who said yes, just I won't say who said no. So a particular thank you to Slung Low here in Leeds, Creative People and Places, who I've already referred to, and Fun Palaces, who all agreed to go on a journey where we looked at all their failures with them. And then what we did, from that we built a framework, which I'm just going to briefly show you now, and then have been testing that in workshops back on the sector to see if it works, to try and build momentum from it. What we found from doing the research is that there was should say that these workshops have attempted to be with everybody who's a stakeholder in that process, so some policy makers who set the participation agenda for many organisations, the practitioners who may be engaging with participation for very different reasons, and the participants themselves who very often don't get a voice in the research. And what was very apparent was they had very different attitudes to failure. Policymakers, by and large, said they had no problem with failure. It was the sector that had a problem, that they weren't open to being honest. But actually, interestingly, when we pushed policymakers to share a failure, they were much less comfortable doing it in practice than thought they would have been. Practitioners, in contrast, tended to be the ones who said, why are you doing this research, it's dangerous and irresponsible, but the ones who actually found it most cathartic going through the process. And many practitioners have said it really kind of empowered them and liberated them to be more honest with themselves, with their teams and with funders in some cases. But the people who were most comfortable talking about failure were the participants. And many of them really kind of were very enthusiastic talking about failure, said that they'd never been asked to talk in that way before and couldn't get enough of sharing stories of failure. But what was apparent there, some participants, particularly from some of the kind of the CPP communities, there was the low participation communities, some of them said that they'd been called failures all their life, and so it was a word they embraced as a kind of reappropriating it themselves, and and wore it as a badge of honour because they had learnt and developed from that process and had the most nuanced understanding, I would say, about the value of learning from failure. Others, like the practitioners and policymakers, just saw it as an opportunity to blame somebody else or talk about somebody else's failures. And there was a kind of tension there about whether they were comfortable talking about failure where there were consequences for them. So that idea about consequences was very important in our research. How you take away that fear of punishment and make it about a willingness to learn. And what we found was that why people found talking about failure difficult was because people often see success and failure as binary opposites. You either succeed or you fail, there isn't any middle ground. And where people see them as opposites, they're really the most uncomfortable talking about it. Ben Oidi referred to that defensiveness in the cultural sector, the precarious nature of the cultural sector, the precarious nature of funding, making people scared to put their head above the parapet and say anything, but that leads to a really difficult protectionism that actually isn't good for them either. And actually many of the policymakers said they could read through the lies in evaluation, so it didn't help them get the funding either. But that idea, as the quote says, of keeping control of the narrative was something really important to lots of people. The idea that they wanted to decide what was said about them, not for somebody to speak for them. When asking people to then, whether they wanted us to do the research or not, to then actually share an example of failure or talk about what they thought the failures of cultural participation were, there were very different responses to that. Policymakers tended to see it as a social failure. There was something wrong with the participants that needed to be fixed, and their policy was going to fix it. Practitioners tended to see it as a policy failure, that they weren't resourcing the right things, they weren't resourcing the participatory work. And lots of participants said it was a failure of practice that wasn't itself kind of meeting their needs or relevant to them. So there was a kind of, in itself, that very idea of what is the problem of participation. There were very, very different responses to it. Where there was more general agreement, though, was that the general approach within the cultural sector of a project mentality, that you're moving on to the next thing all the time, really didn't help. It really doesn't give space for the kind of reflection that encourages honesty and encourages learning and development. So that's not just about talking about failure, that's about any form of learning. That big problem with evaluation is that it is often self-reporting. Lots of people used the phrase self-reporting that doesn't engage a range of stakeholders in the discussion. It's either from a consultant who's been brought in to do the evaluation or from the person who set the project up. And there's very little discussion of the kind of nuanced complexity around success and failure that we see in this quote. This was a very rare example of someone who really recognised that something could be a success and a failure in different ways at different times. So it's a quote saying, you can be a success artistically and still fail your participants, or you can be a success with your participants but it have zero profile in the wider world. And so kind of that understanding about the complexity is really what is at the heart of the framework we've kind of developed. So just before coming to the end, those who are thinking about that drink, so what we kind of concluded from that is that the whole cultural landscape is really not very conducive to honesty at the moment, and that there is a cultural landscape. And it's debatable whether that's particular to the cultural sector or more generally across society. There are quite different of opinions from the people we spoke to about that, whether it's endemic or specific. But I think a broad consensus that it might be particularly bad in the cultural sector, certainly not better than elsewhere. As I alluded to before, there was also a sense that where failure was talked about, there was a bit of a blame culture. So it's always somebody else's fault. It's not something I have power and agency over. And that was, in some ways, the thing that was most telling for me in the sector that talks about giving people agency, how little agency people in the sector themselves felt they had in any of these processes. But fundamentally, there was a breakdown in trust between funders, participants and practitioners, which leads to, I've said at the bottom, the biggest failure, the failure to learn, and without learning, the failure to change. So the framework we've developed, which we're kind of, as I said, embedding at the moment, is kind of an attempt to get people to talk about failure from the beginning of planning a project or a policy or an initiative, right through the delivery, through to the evaluation, and really look at. So at the beginning, we asked people to think, what would success and failure look like for you in this? And by talking about it in the beginning, it's much easier to go back and say, yeah, okay, we did fail, we didn't actually go do as well as we thought on that, but we did better on this. And this chart kind of represents, we've basically identified 5 different facets which we're encouraging people to think about success and failure separately in each dimension, just as the quote before showed. So you can have a success in one area and a failure in the other. And again, people felt much less uncomfortable talking about failure if they could still think of something that they were successful at doing. We're also encouraging that approach to move beyond self-reporting, to talking to everybody involved in the process, and let people fill out their own charts and their own graphs and say what success and failure look like for them, rather than trying to get consensus that we all have to think it looks the same. But crucially, the principle is that success and failure can and do exist across different facets for different people, to different degrees at different times. And the most interesting thing, I guess, is in the different degrees, which you may or may not be able to see at the back there. The idea of moving away from that binary success versus failure to thinking about that very rarely is something an outright success or an outright failure. Most is somewhere in the middle. And the language we've used, is it a tolerable failure? Okay, it was a failure, but we can live with it because it did something else that was worthwhile, it still had value. Or was it a precarious success, that it was a success broadly for some people, but for others less so. And by kind of getting people to think about it at those different degrees, again, people are much more comfortable doing so and really are able to unpick what they're trying to achieve rather than just go for kind of big numbers or simple outcomes. I mean, what we found time and time again in our early research is you'd ask people what the aim was. The aim was to change the world. You'd ask them what the measure of success was, whether they got more funding or whether people had a nice time, which has nothing to do with changing the world. So, where does that leave me now? Obviously, I'm here giving my inaugural lecture because I've got a successful research profile. I've been deemed worthy of becoming a professor. There is buy-in to the framework from the sector. I could give up my job tomorrow and become a consultant. I'm not going to. I don't want to. We're getting so many demands for workshops on our framework, so we've had to employ people to go out into the sector and deliver them for us. And there's a real enthusiasm for the research we're doing. But we had a conference before Christmas in December, where it became really, really apparent to me that there is a danger that our very research becomes performative in the same way that participation has. That people are quite happy to wear the badge. I've got bags out there, which are tote bags that we made for the conference, that say I'm committed to talking about failure. But when you say that's great, and so what have you changed in your practice as a result of that, people suddenly become uncomfortable again. So there's a real question mark for us about how we don't become part of the problem, that you tick the box to say you can talk about failure and still don't actually make any change. So the key questions for me going forward are, how do we take away that discomfort that some people feel and that kind of sense of personal blame, which I would argue is completely unhelpful, and how do we stop the framework becoming the problem rather than the solution? Thank you for listening to me. There is time if anybody has any questions or comments, but otherwise you can come and join us for a drink and just chat at the bar. I think Linda will tell me whether the drink's ready yet. Okay, so you have to ask me some questions then while she checks whether the drink's there. Questions or comments? Of course, my supervisor.
Well, I guess because I wanted to say something, I guess my question to you was, I'll give you at the start, is do you think perhaps you've been too harsh in your judgments? And I'll rehearse some of my thinking in relation to that. You started off, but didn't start, but early on, you were talking about how political theatre hadn't changed the world. And if you talk about the crumbling of capitalism, no, that hasn't happened, certainly. But there were plenty of other things that did happen as a consequence. I remember one of my first projects when I went up to Scotland was going around the Highlands and Islands, examining leisure provision in the Highlands and Islands. I had to establish what was going on in the various facilities around the Highlands and Islands. And I would go to these village halls and they would tell me that they had theatre there. And it turned out the theatre they had was the Chevy at the Stag and Black Oil by 784, yeah. And my brain didn't compute at the time. I found out later
I interviewed them as well.
it was almost 10 years previous that had been there, and that's still lodged in the community memory there. So I think that's one reason why it's important. The second is that people engaging in radical theatre are often accused of preaching to the converted and all the rest of it. And I recognise that as a legitimate criticism. On the other hand, I know how important theatre like that is to me, and renews my resolve to continue to be an obstreperous so-and-so. And I think there's value in that. The third point there is that the ideas of co-creation and co-production have spread into the world of sport, even into the world of football, which you may find hard to believe. I'm sure that's the case. We're currently working on the national evaluation of something called the Actor Through Football project, and it's ingrained in what's going on there. The advantage that the projects there have is that they have funding for 5 years, and so people have said to us that it's a privilege because they have the scope to pay, which was always one of the arguments for the Arts Council funding. But with 5 years funding, we have got time. And more importantly, it does make it easier for us to say what, thinking about projects that haven't worked out for you, because there are 25 of these programs around the country now. Thinking about the bits of your program that have not worked out, can you talk me through what went wrong and what you did about that? And because we're right in at the beginning of that, it's a lot easier to say that, because then you can say, because in the future we're going to do this. If it was at the end, then it might be more of a challenge. So I think that some things have changed for the better, even though you as a cynical academic can't see it, right?
Cynical before as an academic. No, I mean, I think what you said is absolutely what our research is saying. You read the book. I think the example you give there, it's where you locate failure. I think what you've done there is two things that are common, is conflating success and value. So there might be value in that work, but it still might not be successful at doing everything, but it might be successful in doing something. So the 784 example is a brilliant example of how it clearly did have success at leaving a resonance for those people. If that's what the aim was, then that is successful. But it was also trying to do other things. And so understanding the success, and you just gave the example of football that you're working on, of saying from the beginning, what didn't work and what could we do differently on a long-term project. And that was exactly the point I was making about the biggest failure is that project, short-term project that doesn't allow you to do that. In a 5-year project, it allows you to do that. It allows you change. But the biggest failure, I would say, is the failure of project funding. It is this failure of short-term funding. I'm not at all saying there hasn't been some really, really powerful, good participatory work. I'm saying that we need to think about, so what is it that, why have we still got the data saying the same things, why are things unchanged? That may have nothing to do with the projects, that may have to do with the way the funding is distributed, that may have to do with the short-term nature of the projects that are invested in. But unless we have that conversation about, if we take away I don't like the active people survey or the taking part survey as a tool, a measure, but if you use it to set the policy, surely you have to use the same tool to evaluate it. And I'm absolutely saying that's the point of those 5 facets, that we need to not do it just in a crude way of did you meet your targets, but we need to do it in a more nuanced understanding that there are different aims for different people. So what's success for me might not be a success for you. What's a success for the funder is different to a success for the artist, is different to a success for the participant. And so we need evaluations that actually unpick that difference for different people. So the quote in our article is we need to change to talk about success, I'm not going to remember it now, success and failure for whom, to what degree, to what end. So it's what was the purpose of it, who is it successful for, and to what extent is it successful or failure. And as I said, I think very rarely are things either success or the failure. There's somewhere in the middle, and the interesting conversation for me is about that middle ground. I don't know if that answered all your bits. I was looking around to see if I had a pen to write them down. I failed to bring a pen in. Does that answer most of it? Enough? You can pick up it. Yeah.
Hi, I was very struck by the quote from someone who said that we need to hold control of the narrative, basically because we might not work again, and I'm a freelance participatory theatre maker, so I can identify with the, if it's rubbish, will I get hired again? And I wondered if in your work you found any ways to kind of almost, not watertight, but ring-fence a conversation so that people can be fragile and vulnerable, become someone who welcomes conversations about difficult things. It's not a sort of personal problem for me, but in the professional space, did you find ways to perhaps create a safety net for people to have those conversations without there being negative repercussions, or there are other suggestions? And then just one other thing I've just been reflecting on, I'm quite active with Citizens UK, and I've just noticed that in community organising, after every interaction of any kind, a small meeting, a big assembly, there's always an evaluation then and there, and you always say, what could we have done better? Yeah. So I just sort of see there's a sector where it's just innately part of your everyday activity together.
Yeah, and that was something that came from our research. Those practitioners who came from community development. That was my ventriloquist act. Those practitioners who came from a community development background were much more comfortable. I mean, it was. I couldn't claim that as a representative sample of everybody, but from our experience, that was something we noticed, that there were people who definitely found it more easier to do than others. Those who came from arts training found it harder. The other bit of your question about the safe spaces, I guess what we found time and time again, and I do trust the funders on this. It's easy to say it's all the funders' fault. That every funder we spoke to said they were up for that conversation. Every funder said if somebody came to, many sort of support the idea. If somebody comes, as I said, they don't believe the evaluations. They know that they're exaggerated, and they'd be more likely to fund somebody. Was what most of them said. All of them said. If they went to them and honestly said it failed, I know I've reflected on that, and this is what I'd do differently, they would have more confidence funding that. What we've kind of been talking to them about is how they model that to give people confidence in that, because there's a breakdown of trust that people don't believe that's the case. So we are working with funders about how they actually themselves reflect on their own failures, because most of what I'm talking about is policy failure, not project failure, which partly probably answers what you're saying, Jonathan, that I actually think there is some fantastic work being done out there. The failure is to not fund it properly, to not support it properly, to not give it the time for reflection. It's not that, it is in some cases that people are just doing it for the money, but that's not most of the problem.
Thank you. It's really helpful.
So, yeah. say, whether it's in academia, in the cultural sector, I guess that for me is the problem of asking everybody to jump through the same hoops. That there is really good participatory work out there and people who are committed to participatory work, and there are an awful lot of people who do it because they think that's where they'll get funding. Similar to what you're saying, there are people who do public engagement and impact work because they care about it, and people who do it because that's what the funders they think that's what funders are telling them to do. And so I suppose the solution to that has to come from, it's the same answer really, it has to come from policymakers to actually recognise that not everybody does need to, sometimes, Ben's always saying, I hate opera, and I'd have opera banned. It makes me listen to opera quite a lot at home. I quite like opera to listen to, I'm not a big fan of going to sing, I have to admit that. But my issue is that, is about the distribution of funding, and it's about, and I'm perfectly happy for opera to make its case on the basis of protecting the art form, heritage, tradition, contributions, tourism. There are 101 arguments I can make on opera's behalf of why it's important. But actually participation is not the agenda it should be fighting, and it's the idea that those kind of organisations that are made to or choose to because they think that's the one that would win the argument. And I think it's more that. I think it's less that funders make them and more that people think that that's more likely to get the funding. Yeah, there's right at the back.
Thank you for the speech and congratulations, Professor Leila.
Thank you.
I'm so happy to hear the lecture, especially you mentioned how people from being fear of failure and not acknowledging the failure into admitting and this make some change. And you also mentioned that besides the success and the good outcome that the research on failure brought you, they are also facing a gap between the willingness to acknowledge your failure and also the willingness to change. This is actually the cultural phenomena. For example, in China we have a translation of the loser to call those people who always failure, and we also correspondingly have a word called dumping. In English translation means lying down, which means, okay, I understand my fault, my failure, I acknowledge my failure, but I'm not going to take any action. So my question is the research on failure doesn't necessarily lead to good outcome or good change? If the understanding or the acknowledgement of failure leads to bad outcome, so is that still a good thing? And how do you evaluate the research on failure into possible transformation? And is there any further step you want to do to transfer your present research into better outcome?
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, the quite simple answer that I guess it's the same for my research as it is for everything else I'm talking about. It depends for who. For me, success is whether the acknowledgement of failure leads to change. And that's why I ended with that idea that, that my promotion, it could be me being a professor, the example that Doc just gave, it could be that my success was I got promoted, so job done, doesn't matter if anyone reads the research now, I've got promotion. That isn't my criteria for success. For me, my criteria of success is that something changes. But at the conference in December, it was clear that for many people, just the process of talking about it and being in that kind of safe environment and sharing with peers, the catharsis of that was enough for them. They didn't see the need to go on and change. And so that actually created a bit of conflict between them. That is enough. Why is that not enough for you? Why do we have to take that next step, which is exactly what you're saying? And for me, it isn't about resolving that there is a right or wrong answer to that. It is about understanding that people have different perspectives and different definitions of what success and failure. But for me, it leading to change is what success would be. Yeah.
I was wondering if you think that there is this enormous amount of pressure on failure to become this moment of reflection
blame culture, there's a difference between blaming something to avoid the blame yourself and blaming something because it is something external to yourself. And we talked in our research, we asked people to differentiate between things where they felt they had failed and times when they felt they had been failed. And that, I think that distinction is very important. And people responded to us very clearly about also needing to distinguish between those failures which can be learned from and put right, and those failures which cause irreparable harm. And we shouldn't ignore the fact there are those kind of failures too. Linda's giving me the thumbs up that the drinks are there. So, are there any last questions? Oh, there's a hand up there. Last one, and then we'll go to the bottom.
Just building on that point, I guess there are different ramifications and consequences for failure, however it's measured, right? So I just wondered, in terms of your research, if you kind of looked into that as well, or what your findings were in terms of what the ramifications were for different demographics to failure on the kind of policymakers or funders kind of metric.
We talked obviously about, probably not, I think I'm probably going to say not particularly. We talked about that fear of ramifications. I think we tried to demystify a lot of those assumptions that it has different ramifications. But definitely when I said participants were much more comfortable talking about failure, actually with, for example, the Fun Palaces, which is an amateur-led initiative, the participants, the significant difference was, and that came through all our research, the participants wanted everyone to be a participant, the artists are participants too, the policymakers. So, one person said, we don't want to be 64 million artists, which is a campaign in this country, we want to be 64 million participants. We don't want the artists to think they're other to us. And in Fun Palaces, but what was apparent in Fun Palaces where that was the case, where the organisers and the audience equally saw themselves as participants, the organisers were less comfortable talking about failure than the others, which does suggest there is a kind of fear of the consequences, of a sense of responsibility that you're holding it, makes it harder. So we do talk about it in that context, but less about kind of the ramifications for different groups.
Thanks.
Okay, drink!